All right, it has been 1 year since the shocking and frankly unprecedented leak of the Supreme Court Dobbs draft decision, and a lot has happened since then.
Yeah, so let's go off the wall to understand the timeline, the consequences, and the takeaways. And we'll start with the new developments. This week, Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito said the following. He said, "I personally have a pretty good idea who's responsible. That's different from the level of proof that is needed to name somebody." Now, Alito says this at a time when the story had begun to fade into the background. In fact, while we solve much more complicated mysteries, this one remained in the realm of unsolved mysteries.
Correct. The FBI was not brought into the investigation. It was handled internal to the court. It seemed that we're at a stalemate, but it's a tight-knit group, Will, between justices and clerks and staff there. Everybody knows everybody, and you know there's got to be an inkling or a sense. Yeah. Alito probably spoke for many when he said, we probably know who it is, but the burden of proof not quite there yet.
There's a limited pool of suspects. Now, let's recall, as we mentioned, we're approaching 1 year since Politico reported the following.
Exactly.
The headline was, Supreme Court has voted to overturn abortion rights. Draft opinion shows. The draft opinion offers an extraordinary window into the justices' deliberations in one of the most consequential cases before the court in the last 5 decades. Now, just as a clarification and a reminder, this was not, the Supreme Court had not issued the opinion and wouldn't for several more months. This was a leak, and this was reported to put it out there for the public.
Exactly. And the leak happened in May of 2022, although the draft ruling had been written in February. So the court had been mulling over this for a couple of months. 2-3 months later, it comes out. It was leaked by a person familiar with the proceedings, Politico covering their sources there. And again, no draft decision in modern history of the court had been publicly disclosed while the case was pending. This is not something that happens. It's not supposed to happen by tradition, by protocol, by policy inside the court. So right away, everyone's spidey senses went up and said, okay, based on the fact that they're looking to overturn it, this is an intimidation play. Yep. This is someone trying to rattle the cage of justices who might be overturning Roe v. Wade.
And that, in fact, is why we suspect Alito is speaking out now. Because as he mentioned, this puts several people, several Supreme Court justices in the crosshairs of an assassination attempt. Passions high around this subject. It was logical to assume it could manifest in something very dangerous. And it did.
Unfortunately, his name was Nicholas Rosk. He was traveled across the country to the home of Brett Kavanaugh June 8th. So this comes about just more than a month from when that leak happened, as protests, and we'll get to that in a moment as well, are ramping up. He shows up at the house with a pistol, 2 magazines, pepper spray, zip ties, a hammer, a screwdriver, and any other. It wasn't a good plan, Will, but it was ultimately, and he's not stable, right. But it was the result of a lot of anger outside the court.
It doesn't often take a Mission Impossible style of attempt to actually hurt or assassinate someone. And here's what it sounded like on June 8th, 2022, when the 911 call was made.
And you said you came from California. Do you know someone down here?
Brett Kavanaugh.
And you came alone?
Correct.
Okay. And what were you coming to do? Just to hurt yourself and him, or what was going to happen?
Correct.
There you go.
So he called 911 on himself, but admitted who the target was, and there could have been any number of those conservative justices. Remember, he went through a very public,
no doubt,
nomination process, which also elevated his status in the court.
And then people start showing up and protesting. Remember this. This is all of the tension, the turnout on the streets, all before, by the way, again, the Supreme Court opinion is published, and all right here in the neighborhood of Supreme Court justice.
So this is not the Supreme Court. This is the private residence of a Supreme Court justice. It is prohibited by federal law to intimidate officials, political officials, and justices of the court. Yet what we saw at that moment was political authorities, whether it was Nancy Pelosi, whether it was Joe Biden, whether it was Governor Hogan of Maryland, took very little recourse to stop these intimidation efforts. That's not a legal thing they were doing. They were never stopped from doing so.
And we just heard from Shannon Bream that while it's not covered any longer, this is still taking place, these protests.
That was amazing to me to hear.
In front of the justice.
Still happening in front of the houses of justice today. Now, they did eventually get limited private security. I think Nancy Pelosi, the speaker, was forced to do at a minimum that, but it came only after a public outcry.
1 month after these protests, after the fallout from the leak, comes the actual opinion that overturns Roe v. Wade. In June, the Supreme Court published that opinion, June 24th, 2022. The protests now spill over into the public in front of the court.
Well, there were protests, but there were also a lot of celebrations across America because Roe v. Wade had been overturned 50 years later. A lot of people working and praying for that moment and grateful for justices who were not intimidated. Ultimately, the leaker was not effective. The ruling that came out mirrored almost exactly the draft ruling that was leaked in May.
And so here's where we stand today, quickly, on the Supreme Court leaker. As of January 19th, they published a report, Key Investigation and Takeaways, and they concluded they could not determine, somewhat shockingly for all of us, who that leaker is. They focused on 82 people who had access or who would have had access to that type of information.
They said it wasn't a hack, likely, and they said they're increasing security. Here's maybe the frustrating part, Will. Focus on 82 people, but you can probably pretty quickly whittle it down based on what people know about certain individuals who had access to additional, what their motivations might have been. But maybe they did a wider search just to make it look like they're looking into everybody. I don't know.